Okay, yes. Thank you for turning out to my second lecture. I would like to just open with one brief explanatory comment, which is you might be asking yourselves, and I would certainly ask it if I were in the audience, why is he, if he's speaking about translation and so forth, why is he speaking in English and not in German? And I'll give you a simple answer. I guess it's a very simple answer. Your English is better than my German is. Yeah, I can speak some German. I lived in Regensburg for 6 months. I had studied German for a couple of years before that, and I worked very hard on my German, and I got reasonably good when I lived in Regensburg. And then I lived another 3 months just recently in Vienna, and my German got even better. But that doesn't mean it's great. It's reasonable, okay? My English is a lot better than my German is, and your English is probably on the average better than my German is. So that's a simple explanation. I don't want to make you suffer along with my medium good German. I might as well go with my very fluent English. So that's a simple answer to that question. Hopefully satisfactory answer. The other thing that I wanted to do before the actual lecture starts is I wanted to repeat what I said yesterday about Helga Thomas Keller, who was, some of you were here yesterday and some of you were not, I'm sure. Helga was the woman who worked at my side at the Center for Research on Concepts and Cognition in Bloomington, Indiana for 22 years as my administrative assistant, and she was a very, very lively and independent spirit who did a lot of wonderful things, and then she died unexpectedly in 2011, and it was a very sad event. And I wanted to she grew up in the Köln area, and so I feel like I'm in Helga's territory here, and so I wanted to make these lectures dedicated to her memory or in her honor. And I thought that a nice gesture would be to take the end of when she died, I was asked to be one of the, I think, 3 speakers at the memorial service in her name. And I decided that Helga so deeply loved her native language, German, and she deeply loved poetry, and so I looked through a lot of German poems to try to find a German poem that could somehow represent my feelings. And I found one by Goethe, and I knew she would insist that I translate it into English, because she knew how much I love the act of translating poetry. And so, of course, I did that. But then, just for the fun of it, I sent out that same poem to some friends, just a couple, and I got back some other translations. And one was from my friend Jim Phelan, a professor of Russian at the University of Tennessee, retired, emeritus, and his translation was very beautiful. And I decided, because Jim knew Helga quite well, and they respected each other very highly, that I would make a splice, a hybrid of Jim's translation and mine. And so I'm going to open with a presentation of the Goethe poem with a hybrid translation by myself and my good friend Jim Phelan. So I think we need this. And here is the poem itself, Nähe des Geliebten. Ich denke dein, wenn mir der Sonne Schimmer vom Meere strahlt. Ich denke dein, wenn sich des Mondes Flimmer in Quellen malt. Ich sehe dich, wenn auf dem fernen Wege der Staub sich hebt. In tiefer Nacht, wenn auf dem schmalem Stege der Wanderer bebt. Ich höre dich, wenn dort mit dumpfem Rauschen die Welle steigt. Im stillen Haine gehe ich oft zu lauschen, wenn alles schweigt. Ich bin bei dir, du seist auch noch so ferne, du bist mir nah. Die Sonne sinkt, bald leuchten mir die Sterne, o wärst du da. And now, oh, I guess I have to use my little thing. Forgot. So, let's see if this works. I don't know where to point it. It's not working yet. Maybe it's not turned on, or maybe it doesn't have a battery. Ah, there we are. In memory of Helga Keller, Douglas Hofstadter, and James Phelan. I'll think of you whenever sunlight's glimmer on ripples breaks. I'll think of you whenever moonlight's shimmer reflects from lakes. I'll see your face when over distant rivers the mist takes flight, or when upon a bridge a wanderer quivers in deepest night. I'll hear your voice when harking to the surging of waves that rush. In peaceful groves, I'll hear your voice emerging from midst the hush. You may be far, but still I am attendant. I hold you near. The sun has set. The stars are now ascendant. Were you but here. So that's in honor of Helga Keller, Helga Thomas Keller. And now we move my new title, exactly as Andreas anticipated, a different title from the bland one that I originally said. The Parthenon, Wang Wei, Morgenstern, Nabokov, Pushkin, and the beauty of Huti. Okay, so we'll begin a little bit like yesterday. So some of you weren't here yesterday. I'll open with sort of the same opening, but we'll quickly diverge from yesterday's talk. But it's good to begin with something, with a very simple true or false question, and another one just like it. Did you read Romeo and Juliet when you were at the gymnasium? Well, I'll say for you, of course. I don't know if you did or not, but I'll pretend that you did. Of course. Although you read it in German. Have I ever been in the Parthenon? Of course. Although I was in it in Tennessee. And there's the Parthenon in Greece, and there's the Parthenon in Tennessee. Dare I say, there is the Parthenon? Is that the Parthenon? Of course, the phrase the Parthenon is a little blurry. You could say this is the Parthenon in Tennessee as opposed to the Parthenon in Greece. But if I just say there is the Parthenon, is that the Parthenon? Interesting question. If I visit a Parthenon reconstructed halfway around the globe, can I validly claim I've been in the Parthenon? Probably not. And if you have read a translation of Romeo and Juliet into German, can you validly claim I've read the play itself? Hopefully so. But why? What's the difference? What is translation? Bringing across, just etymologically across, bringing. What can or cannot bringing across accomplish? Now, some negative views of translation, and believe me, there are many. I've just selected a few. Les traductions sont comme les femmes. Lorsqu'elles sont belles, elles ne sont pas fidèles. Et lorsqu'elles sont fidèles, elles ne sont pas belles. Thomas Mann. Well, I would say this is a negative view of women, not of translation. And it sort of says why they might be negative views, because this was a Mann speaking. So let's not worry about this one. Another one. what a translator tries for is no more than the best possible failure. By an American poet, a very successful poet, who also translated, John Chardy. That's so pessimistic. Then we have the famous Italian saying, traduttore, traditore. And I'll just, if you don't mind, translate it into English. Translator, trader. Now the funny thing about this is that the English translation is perfect. There is no betraying whatsoever of the Italian, and it contradicts, this translation into English completely contradicts and undermines and blows out of the water the claim of the Italian phrase. It makes no sense. It's a perfect translation. The phonetic echo is just as strong in English as it is in Italian. So I decided that really the appropriate way to think of this is not as translator-traitor, but as translator-trader. When you do translation, you trade things in one language for things in the other language. You get some advantages and you get some disadvantages, and if you're good enough, it balances out and it comes out about even. So I like this phrase, and in fact, I wrote a book, or a half a book, you might say. I'll explain that. I translated a novel by Françoise Sagan from French, and on the back side of it, this is not actually accurate. This should be upside down, really, because if you flip the book, you get another book. And the other book is called Translator Trader. I'll show you this. This is what it's called, Translator Trader, an essay on the pleasantly pervasive paradoxes of translation. And it's about what I did when I translated the novel by Françoise Sagan. I always like to see when translators write prefaces to their books or afterwards, just as I like to see notes by a performer of music when they perform a piece on a record and then they comment on it, or if they get up on the stage and they play it and they give you some comments before or after. I always enjoy that, and so I indulged myself in doing that, and this is, it says, it's an essay by a translator-trader who believes in the reality of high-quality translation. Why are there so many cynical, negative, skeptical, pessimistic views of the art of translation? I do not know. That's all there is to it. I don't know. So, we'll now go to begin with looking at some translations. We'll go back to the thing we began with yesterday, the poem by Wang Wei, a poet from a long, long time ago, Tang Dynasty, Lu Zhai. And I'll read it once again. I'll just show it to you once again, or in some people's case, for the first time. So here it is, written out vertically, in that manner. Lu Zhai meaning essentially something like deer park or deer manor. This is Lu Zhai. And okay, so I'll read it in Chinese and then we'll talk about what it means, and then we'll talk about translations. Okay, 空山不见人，但闻人语响，返影入山林。复照青苔上. So let's look at what it means, one character at a time, one syllable at a time in English. Oops. Oh yes, I forgot. I want to point out something that I very much like about this poem. When you print it out like this. Isn't that pretty? It just struck me. This means person, ren, it's also here. And this means to enter or in, ru. So ren and ru, they make a nice little symmetry right at the very center of the poem, and I really like that. Okay. So here is the one word for one word rendition in English. Oops. Empty hill, not see person, but hear person language sound. Return shadow, enter deep forest, again shine green moss on. Doesn't maybe make a whole lot of sense this way, but in order to make it make more sense, let me show you a very nice translation by Vikram Seth. He translated it into what he thought was an equivalent poem in the English language, Vikram Seth. So here it is. Empty hills, no man in sight, just echoes of the voice of men. In the deep wood, reflected light shines on the blue-green moss again. And I guess yesterday I showed, I think, 6 or so translations at the beginning of the lecture by different people, and in this case I'm just showing you one because maybe it's my favorite. Although I have to say, just as I said yesterday, that I'm annoyed at the sexism inherent in this use of the word man and men. It doesn't correspond to sexism, any sexism in the Chinese version, which is not to say that the Chinese language is absent, has no sexism in it. It's filled to the brim with sexism, just as almost all languages are. But in this particular poem, there's no sexism, but there is in the English version, unfortunately, in this particular English version. So I liked it in some ways, but I had a strong reaction to or against it, as well as to or against many other versions of this poem. And I said this yesterday, namely, why not pay attention to the poem's form? Meaning, why not make an English poem with exactly 20 syllables, 4 lines with 5 syllables each? That's what I thought was screaming out as the natural thing to do, especially after I saw so many translations of this poem that didn't do that or didn't even make the slightest attempt to do it. And I thought, how weird. So, here is what I came up with after a lot of hard work, and I showed this yesterday. Bleak peak, spy no folk, but hark, hush-like talk. Sunflecks pierce dark bosk, flick back off green bark. And as I said yesterday, just in case you don't know this unusual word, it means a grove of trees or a little forest. So if I color in some of the words, you can see all of the words that I use that end in the K sound. Bleak, peak, folk, hark, like, talk, flex, dark, bosk, flick, back, bark. There's even a pretty geometry to it. 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1. It's got a lot of interesting kind of structural properties. Why did I do that? Well, because, as it says here, I'm tipping my hat to the very limited number of distinct syllables in Chinese and the extremely tiny set of final consonants in Chinese. In Mandarin, there's basically N and NG. You can also have R under certain circumstances, but essentially, anyway, the number of final consonants in Mandarin is tiny, and in any version of Chinese, whether it's Mandarin or Cantonese or any other version, it's tiny. And so I was sort of tipping my hat to that fact about Chinese and having a lot of fun at the same time. But I felt also, I had a friend who critiqued my translation, this one, and he felt that it didn't quite do it for him. I mean, he speaks Chinese very fluently, and he had some complaints about it, and he thought it wasn't as easily understandable, or I don't know, I can't remember what his complaints were, but it made me go back to the drawing board and try again 20 syllables. And so I simplified the vocabulary a little bit and explored further. And here's what I came up with. Bleak peak, no one seen, but here snips of voice. Late light spins through woods, shines back on green moss. And as you'll see that I got a little bit of a sort of a rhyme here, voice and moss, not here. And I had some nice little alliterations, bleak peak and late light. And it was simpler, but maybe clearer, maybe better in some ways. But I then couldn't help but do something that I thought would bring it closer to the original Chinese. I said to myself, Wang Wei didn't use punctuation marks. Wang Wei didn't use capital letters. So let me take those punctuation marks out and the capital letters out. And then I get this, bleak peak. Well, you've already heard it, so I don't need to read it again. But that's what I got. And then I thought, wait a second. This doesn't have anything like the geometry of his poem. His poem was like the words were in a very nice array. So I decided I should really put them into an array. So here I have a nice column, a column, a column, a column, a column. So bleak peak, no one seen, etc. But then I said to myself, wait a minute, this wasn't how it was done in Chinese originally. It was originally vertical, not horizontal. So I rearranged it. Bleak peak, no one seen, but here snips a voice, late light spins, etc. So that was happy. But then I thought, this doesn't look like the original. And I remembered, I was thinking, this is a nice Baskerville typeface. And I thought, well, why not use a typeface that has brush strokes in it? And there's a typeface called brush script. So I decided I would do that. So I changed it all into brush script. And then I started to feel a little bit happier. And now I want to point something out to you. Spins and snips. I was very pleased with that. And don't think it's an accident. Moreover, I have no and on. I decided I'd go a little further. So it's a complete palindrome. On, spins, snips, no. On, spins, snips, no. I was really having fun. But then I went a little further. I said, gee, Chinese characters are supposed to fill up a square. They're supposed to be square in form. They're not supposed to be horizontal things like that. That doesn't look like a Chinese character. So I took each monosyllable and broke it up into two pieces and put them vertically like that. Well, there's the original poem. There it is. There they are together again. And there's my poem. And that's what I settled with. That was my solution. So you can ask yourself, would an English language reader of this translation have stood in the original Parthenon of Wang Wei's original poem? Who knows? But it's an interesting question. Bleak peak, no one seen. That's a bleak peak. Actually, there is somebody right there. What is translation? Bringing across. What can or cannot bringing across accomplish? More negative views of translation. We're going to have a bunch of them. Great originals shine even through awkward translations. Christian Morgenstern. By the way, I have only seen this in English. I assume he didn't say it in English. So, there is no such thing as a good or a better translation of poetry from another language. There are only poor and less poor renderings. Christian Morgenstern. So, let's take Christian Morgenstern. Well, sorry, I guess, why are there so many cynical, negative, skeptical, pessimistic views of our translation? I do not know. Anyway, let's take Christian Morgenstern, and look at a poem by him. I will comment that many, many years ago, I had a very close friend, who is still a very close friend, whose father was a professor of German, and he had in his library a volume of Christian Morgenstern poems, which he said were untranslatable because they were so wonderfully deeply married to the German language. And then one day, I don't remember how I came across it, but somebody, I think, sent me, I don't know, a book of Christian Morgenstern poems translated into English. It was a two-language volume. It had the originals and the translations. And the translations were by somebody I had never heard of named Max Knight. So I'm going to show you this poem in the original German and then the translation by Max Knight. Der Lattenzaun. Es war einmal ein Lattenzaun, mit Zwischenraum hindurchzuschauen. Ein Architekt, der dieses sah, stand eines Abends plötzlich da und nahm den Zwischenraum heraus und baute draus ein großes Haus. Der Zaun indessen stand ganz dumm, mit Latten ohne was herum. Ein Anblick grässlich und gemein. Drum zog ich der Senat auch ein. Der Architekt jedoch entfloh nach Afri und Ameriko. Very cute, and I'm sure most of you are native speakers and you are enjoying it. Maybe you've read it before, hopefully you have. Now, of course, everybody would agree that this is very closely married to the German language. Does that mean, though, necessarily that it is untranslatable? And I would answer no, it does not mean that. You have to marry it equally well to the English language. That's all. Let's look at what Max Knight did with it. The picket fence, Max Knight. There used to be a picket fence with space to gaze from hence to thence. An architect who saw this sight approached it suddenly one night, removed the spaces from the fence, and built of them a residence. The picket fence stood there dumbfounded with pickets wholly unsurrounded, a view so naked and obscene the Senate had to intervene. The architect, however, flew to Afri or Americo. Now, I hope you like that. I think it's charming, delightful, and, you know, it's on the same level. I won't say it's worse or better. I'll say it's roughly at the same level as the original. That's my opinion. That's my personal opinion. You, of course, have the right to disagree. Now, I'm a person who, I guess, loves to compete. And so once I had seen this, I felt I had to get into the game myself, and I had to do my own translation of the Christian Morgenstern. Of course, I had the benefit of having already seen a very good English translation. But nonetheless, benefit or not, it doesn't mean that I'm going to use that English translation. It just means I've been shown that it can be done. This act can be done. Once you know it can be done, maybe that gives you a little bit more confidence that you can do a good job. So here's what I did. A picket fence, lo many a year, had pickets dense, 'tween which to peer. An architect who this did spy, one eve, out of the clear blue sky, stole all the space betwixt its sticks, and built therewith a house, such bricks. This fact our fence did sadly stun. It now had slats, but slits had none. 'Twas such an eyesore and a blight, town council deemed it dynamite. The architect, though up and flew to Afric or Americo. So that's my version. Again, I think it's about at the same level, if you allow me to pat myself on the back. I'm very fond of it. And I translated 2 or 3 other Christian Morgenstern poems, and they're my translations, as well as Max Knight's, and some by Walter Arndt, another German who translated into English. These are all found in my book, Le Tombeau de Marot, which I don't think is available outside, ironically, nor is the other one that I just showed, Translator Trader. They got a bunch of books by me out there, but they didn't bother to get the ones on translation. Ironically, pretty weird. Oh well. I didn't know there would be any books for sale at all. If they had asked me, I would have said, make sure you get Le Tombeau de Marot and Translator Trader and the translation of Françoise Sagan's novel, but they didn't ask me. So, would an English language reader of either Max Knight's or my own English translation have stood in the true Parthenon of Morgenstern's German poem? I'm not going to answer that question. I'm just asking it. Can you say, at least without talking about Parthenons, can an English reader who has never learned a word of German except Gesundheit, which we all know, and Kindergarten, maybe a few others, but not very many. Can an English reader who has read only Max Knight's translation or my translation say, oh yes, I read Christian Morgenstern's poem, I really like it. Very, very fun, very charming use of language. What a master of language Christian Morgenstern is. Can you say that if you've read only the English? Interesting question. What is translation bringing across? What can or cannot bringing across accomplish? Now we will take up the case of Vladimir Nabokov and Eugene Onegin. This is a very long and complicated case, and I will only be scratching the surface. Nonetheless, let's go ahead. Let me explain. You may or may not know that Eugene Onegin, or Yevgeny Onegin in Russian, is, well, you probably know that Yevgeny Onegin or Eugen Onegin is an opera by Tchaikovsky. Well, yes and no. That's what it has become mostly associated with outside of Russia. Inside Russia, it's quite another story. Inside Russia, Eugene Onegin is thought of as the greatest work of all of Russian literature. Has nothing to do with an opera. Of course, the Russians are very familiar with the opera, but it's a completely different thing. For them, Pushkin is the greatest Russian who ever lived. He is the founder of their language and of their literature. And his greatest work is Eugene Onegin, which is a novel in verse. And it consists of roughly 380 so-called Onegin stanzas, which have a very particular form, which I'm just about to illustrate. Now, it has always, of course, because this poem, this novel in verse, is so profoundly wedded to the Russian language, people have said for a very long time that it is untranslatable. And certain people have made practically their reputations on saying that it is untranslatable. And I'm going to tell you about one of them. It's not his only reputation, but it's one of his claims to fame, and that person is Vladimir Nabokov. Nabokov decided, after struggling for a little while, I don't know how long, with trying to versify Eugene Onegin, the original, in English, that it was, as he put it, mathematically impossible. a curious phrase, as if he could prove a theorem that it said it was mathematically impossible. But I'm not going to go into that. He claimed that it was impossible, and he then decided, for reasons of his own, that he was going to render the poem, the novel in verse, in English by making a word-for-word translation, dropping all of the meter or rhythm, and dropping all of the rhymes, and so forth and so on, and just giving a very, very, very literal word-for-word translation. And then, amusingly enough, he wrote 2 Onegin stanzas about this fact. And these 2 stanzas, in which he apologizes to Pushkin for doing this, were published in the New Yorker magazine, roughly in 1964. I don't remember, maybe it was earlier. In any case, when he was working on, or had just finished, his word-for-word translation of Eugene Onegin into English. So I'm going to show you the first of them. I'm going to show them both to you, but I'm first going to show you one of them because it illustrates beautifully what an Onegin stanza is, and I'm going to be talking about Onegin stanzas, so you need an example. So let's use Vladimir Nabokov's Onegin stanza, in which he apologizes to Pushkin for not using Onegin stanzas in his translation. A little bit tricky, complicated. What is this? Negative views. Well, here it is. Yeah, this is just the beginning of it. It's 14 lines long. I'm just showing it bit by bit. What is translation? On a platter, a poet's pale and glaring head, a parrot's screech, a monkey's chatter, and profanation of the dead. The parasites you were so hard on are pardoned, if I have your pardon, O Pushkin, for my stratagem. I traveled down your secret stem and reached the root and fed upon it. Then, in a language newly learned, I grew another stalk and turned your stanza, patterned on a sonnet, into my honest roadside prose, all thorn but cousin to your rose. Nabokov. Now, I want to tell you something about this. I color-coded it, and let me explain what the color coding is. The color coding, well, let me first say that, I'll go ahead for a moment and just go on to the next thing where I explain it, and then I'll go back. And this is a lovely Onegin stanza. What is an Onegin stanza? It's 14 lines of iambic tetrameter. So, da-dum, 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 da-dum. That's iambic tetrameter. 14 lines of that. It has a very fixed rhyme scheme. Always this. A, B, A, B, C, C, D, D, E, F, F, E, G, G. Always exactly that rhyme scheme. Onegin stanzas are like that. Moreover, lines A, C, E, and E, which I've color-coded in green here, A, C, C, E, E, have so-called feminine rhymes, which means they have one extra unstressed syllable at the end. Da-dum, 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 da. They have one extra da. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da at the end. So they have 9 syllables. So 6 of these lines have 9 syllables, and the others have masculine rhymes, which means 8 syllables. That's my little lesson on what an Onegin stanza is, and now we'll go back. Sorry, I have to do this bit by bit. Okay, here's the Onegin stanza, and let's just look at it. So here we have platter and chatter. This is a 2-syllable rhyme, platter, chatter. This is an identical syllable, and this, the stressed syllable, plat and chat, are not identical. They rhyme. That's a feminine rhyme. A similar one, hard on, pardon. Upon it, sonnet. So ponnet, sonnet. Those are feminine rhymes, A, C, C, E, E. Then we have B, B, D, D, F, F, G, G, and these are masculine rhymes. Head, dead, gem, stem, learned, turned, prose, rose. And so that is a nice example, as I said, of Onyegin's, come on, stanza. Let me now show the second of Nabokov's two stanzas that he wrote in apologizing to the great Pushkin with whom Nabokov so identified. Reflected words can only shiver like elongated lights that twist in the blank mirror of a river between the city and the mist. Elusive Pushkin, persevering, I still pick up your damsel's earring, still travel with your sullen rake. I find another man's mistake. I analyze alliterations that grace your feasts and haunt the great fourth stanza of your Canto 8. This is my task, a poet's patience and scholastic passion blent, dove droppings on your monument. I'm not going to try to explain all of this. For those of you who know what this means, you can appreciate it, and it certainly is. He's humbling himself, he's prostrating himself in front of the great Pushkin. And it's an interesting thing, very interesting. Now, he had this weird translation philosophy that I already described, which was respect only content, never respect form. Now, I don't believe that he really meant this. I think it was a fake act that he put on. And the reason I think he faked this act is complicated. I'm not going to go into it in great length. But basically it was that he felt he was a failure at translating it, and he wanted thereby to state that nobody could do it. If he, the great Vladimir Nabokov, couldn't do it, then certainly nobody could do it. And so he set out to do, he didn't want to, let me phrase it another way. People who had tried to translate it, he put into a circle. He said, oh, here are here is this translator and this translator and this translator. They all belong in this circle of failures. I'm not going to enter into that circle. People who had tried to do it into verse, rhyming and metrically. I'm not going to do that. I stand apart. I'm not in their circle. I won't be compared with them. I did only this modest act of translating it literally. And if anybody wants to really appreciate it, well, let them go and learn Russian. That's it. It can only be read in Russian, really. That was his put-on pseudo-credo. You don't believe me? Well, let's take a look at what Nabokov himself wrote about his version of Onegin. I've taken this from his own writings, just quoting him. In transposing Eugene Onegin from Pushkin's Russian into my English, I have sacrificed to completeness of meaning every formal element, including the iambic rhythm, whenever its retention hindered fidelity. To my ideal of literalism, I sacrificed everything: elegance, euphony, clarity, good taste, modern usage, and even grammar, that the dainty mimic prizes higher than truth. He used these words of scorn to describe anyone who would have the audacity to try to render it as verse in English, because he, of course, had proven it was mathematically impossible. Is that not enough? If you don't think it's enough, let's take a look at more by Nabokov. My Eugene Onegin falls short of the ideal crib meaning literal translation. It is still not close enough and not ugly enough. His goal was to make it ugly. In future editions, I plan to defowlerize it still more drastically. In case that word is not familiar to you, he invented the word. It came from the fact that there was at that time a very famous manual of English usage by Fowler, and it said, what is good usage of English? And so to defowlerize something is to have bad usage. So that's what he meant by that. I think I shall turn it entirely into utilitarian prose with a still bumpier brand of English, rebarbative barricades of square brackets and tattered banners of reprobate words in order to eliminate the last vestiges of bourgeois poesy and concession to rhythm. This is something to look forward to. So, I think this is a bunch of malarkey, to put it politely, which means hogwash, horse feathers, balderdash, poppycock, moonshine, claptrap, baloney, hokum, twiddle, tripe, trash, and nonsense. And since it's so much malarkey, let's celebrate it in verse. And this was done by a student of mine in a course that I taught on verse translation, and it's really a brilliant piece of work by Bradley Ritchie, as you will see at the bottom. Vladimir Nabokov's pseudo-credo, Onyeganized. Onegin mind still fails to render great Pushkin's words in perfect prose. To truth must beauty yet surrender before my efforts reach a close. My future drafts must capture meaning without sweet meters intervening. From bumpy prose there shall arise forbidding ramparts in the guise of brackets, and from towers flying old tattered banners, all composed of thorny words, shall be disclosed that bourgeois poesy lies dying. No content changed for grace's sake, this quest I crave to undertake. Bradley Ritchie. Marvelous Onegin stanza mocking Nabokov's stance. Now, many people, heroic people, decided that, my usual question, you know what I say, okay. Many people decided that they wanted to tackle the challenge of translating Eugene Onegin into languages other than Russian, because, after all, it is the greatest work, according to Russians, of Russian literature, and it would be quite ridiculous if it were not available in any other language. So, I'm going to talk about some of the translations that I have seen and that I deeply appreciate, that I really think are marvelous. And you will see that one of them, probably the greatest into English, was done by my great friend, James Phelan. And we'll take a look at this. But we're going to begin Eugene Onegin, Roman v stichach, Eugene Onegin, novel in verse, with one stanza that I chose by Pushkin in Russian. It happens to be at the dead center of the novel. The novel consists of 8 chapters, and I happen to be particularly in love. Well, I love so many of the stanzas. I mean, I've devoted a great deal of my life to this book. But I particularly love this particular stanza, chapter 5, number 1, right in the middle, right in the exact middle of the book. So let's go through it in Russian. Not that I'm not going to do anything with it. I'm just going to pronounce it so you can hear an Onegin stanza in Russian, and then we'll look at some translations. В тот год осенняя погода стояла долго на дворе. Зиму ждала природа, снег выпал только в январе. На третью ночь, проснувшись рано, в окно увидела Татьяна поутру побелевший двор, куртины, кровли и забор. На стеклах легкие зоры, деревья в зимнем серебре, сорок веселых на дворе, и мягко усланные горы зимы блистательным ковром. Все ярко, все бело кругом. By the way, I just want you to see this word, Belor, which means white. In Russian, it occurs, I think, elsewhere in here, but I just want you to remember this word, white. Here, I've decided why not tip my hat once more to Nabokov, give you his rendering of this, literal in English. Notice that I did not indent, because these lines are not separated into masculine and feminine rhymes. They're just ordinary English prose. So just let's read it so that you know what the content is in this awkward rendition. That year, autumnal weather was a long time abroad, which means it lasted for a long time. Nature kept waiting and waiting for winter. Snow only fell in January on the night of the 2nd. Waking early, Tatiana from the window saw at morn the whitened yard, flower beds, roofs, and fence, delicate patterns on the panes, that is, the window panes, the trees in winter silver, gay magpies outside, and the hills mellowly spread over with the resplendent rug of winter. All is brilliant, all is white around. Now, that's fine. It gives you a sense of what it is about, but it doesn't give you any sense at all of the beautiful magic that makes Russians fall in love with this novel. It gives you zero sense of that. And I'm going to start out with a translation that I greatly love by an American translator named, of all things, Babette Deutsch. And she did her translation in 1936. And Nabokov, in his translation, he wrote critical commentaries about all translations into English that had preceded his. And he tore them to shreds as much as he possibly could with the nastiest language that you can imagine. And I'm not going to reproduce that language because it's not even worth it. If you're interested, you can go look it up yourselves. It's easy to find. But my point is, I think Babette Deutsch did a magnificent job in conveying the beauty of this stanza and of most of the stanzas in the book in her wonderful verse translation. And so let's look at it. Babette Deutsch, 1936. That year was extraordinary. The autumn seemed so loath to go. Upon the 3rd of January, at last by night arrived the snow. Tatiana, still an early riser, found a white picture to surprise her. The courtyard white, a white parterre, the roofs, the fence, all molded fair. The frostwork o'er the panes was twining, the trees in wintry silver gleamed, and in the court gay magpies screamed, while winter's carpet, softly shining, upon the distant hills lay light, and all she looked on glistened white. It's perfect in almost any way that you could consider it to be. It's just as good as the original, in my opinion. And well, let's go on and look at a translation into German done by Elfriede Eckart-Skalberg in 1947. In jenem Jahr blieb's lange neblig und ward nicht winterlich und klar. Des Frostes harrte man vergeblich. Es schneite erst im Januar, da sah am Morgen früh des 3. Tatjane endlich sich inmitten der kalten und doch weißen Pracht, die sich entfaltet über Nacht. Und durch die eisgeblümten Scheiben sah sie, was vorher grau und braun, das Scheunendach, den alten Zaun, versilbert von dem Flockentreiben, die Berge sanfter hingestreckt, und Baum und Strauch weiß zugedeckt. That's a beautiful Onegin stanza, in my opinion. And I'm going to give you some others in German as well so that you can get a feeling for the variety, and it's a remarkable variety, of how one can do, how one can translate a beautiful poem in many different ways. But my next contribution is from my great friend, Jim Phelan, 1990. The fall that year was in no hurry, and nature seemed to wait and wait for winter. Then, in January, the second night, the snow fell late. Next day, as dawn was just advancing, Tatiana woke, and idly glancing, beheld outdoors a wondrous sight. The roofs, the yard, the fence, all white, each pane a fragile pattern showing. The trees in winter silver dyed, gay magpies on the lawn outside, and all the hilltops soft and glowing with winter's brilliant rug of snow, the world all fresh and white below. Below. Remember that word? He was playing a little game. I think it was quite charming. Below in Russian means white, but here he is below. In any case, let me say a couple of things about this. It was through Jim Phelan's translation that I came to know Eugene Onegin, and I fell head over heels in love with it. I felt, and this you can consider paradoxical or nonsensical, but I don't think of it that way. I felt that I was reading Pushkin, and I would say, Pushkin, what a fantastic user of language. He used language so wonderfully. And yet, whose language was I actually talking about? Well, it's hard to say, isn't it? In some sense, it's Pushkin. In some sense, it's Jim Phelan. And Jim Phelan was profoundly inspired by Alexander Pushkin. Extraordinarily profoundly. It's hard to say how deeply he loved this work and still loves it. It's hard to explain it. I might comment that the Russians, many Russians, memorize the entire book. And they don't do it because they're told to do it in school. They do it effortlessly because they so profoundly love it. And all I can say is I felt that way about Jim Phelan's translation. I think I loved his translation as much as any Russian loved the original. Now we'll go on to Ulrich Busch, 1981. Als ob gar nicht enden wollte, so lange blieb der Herbst dies Jahr. Dass endlich Winter werden sollte, verlangte die Natur, doch war bis Neujahr noch kein Schnee gefallen. Erst eines Morgens, als vor allen Tatjana ahnungsvoll erwacht ans Fenster trat, lag alle Pracht des Winters vor ihr ausgebreitet. Der Hof, die Dächer und der Zaun, im dämmerigen Morgengrauen versilbert, und im Anschauen weitet allmählich sich das ganze Tal zu einem festlich hellen Saal. So I think this is a very elegant, another beautiful Onegin stanza, quite different from the one we saw just a moment ago in German. Now, the next one I'm going to show is, as you might be anticipating, by myself, because I fell in love with Eugene Onegin in the early 1990s so profoundly that it's too long a story to tell. I gradually found myself being dragged, kicking and screaming, you might say, into the act of translating it. I never intended to do it. But one thing led to another, and to my own enormous surprise, I wound up translating the entire novel myself. And curiously enough, my translation was published in the year 1999, which by coincidence, or maybe not by coincidence, was Pushkin's 200th birth year. Just a nice fact. So I'm going to show you my translation of this stanza, which is somewhat different from the two earlier ones you saw in English. That year autumnal weather hated to take its leave from mead and dell. The world ere for winter waited. 'Twas January ere snow fell, the third by night. By dawnlight waking, Tatyana by her sill was taking the morn's white farmyard in, the sheds, the fence, the roofs, the flower beds, the glasses' faint fantastic tracery, the trees with wintry silver decked, the court with merry magpies flecked, the mountain tops light lucid lacery, their dazzling glistening wintry shawl. The air was crisp, bright white was all. And now I have to show you something again. Pardon me for doing this, but I have a weakness. I like structure. I like playing with structure. Why did I do this when Pushkin didn't do it? Well, I'll tell you, it's very simple. When I had translated this stanza into English, I noticed that by some chance or quirk of fate, roughly 9 or 8, I don't remember, of the lines began already with the letter T. And I had just thought, wow, 8 out of 14 lines already begin with T. I wonder if I can't just kind of adjust it a little bit. And I did, and I worked like a devil. Maybe I should say, wie der Teufel, since it begins with T. But I really worked extremely hard, and I will tell you, one of the greatest experiences of my life was going to Tennessee. I went many times, sometimes with my children and sometimes alone, to visit Jim and Eve Phelan in their house. Before I was working on my translation, and then after I had just barely finished it, but it wasn't yet completely cast in concrete. And I went down and I drove down to Tennessee, 6 hours drive through beautiful mountains, and I arrived at their house and I spent 3 hours with them, 3 days with them, reading aloud my translation. We all sat in their living room or on their porch, and we read aloud my translation. Eve would read some, Jim would read some, I would read some, and of course Jim would every once in a while stop and recite a stanza of his own translation that he had committed to memory. And we would have lots of fun. You can't imagine how many laughs we had. We had the greatest time. And when we came to this particular stanza, they enjoyed this, and Jim helped me rewrite one of the lines. I don't remember any longer which one it was, but he helped me rewrite one of the lines to make it flow a little better. So I really thought that was a nice touch. I guess we move on now to one more German translation, which is my favorite. Not being a native speaker, I'm not sure whether my taste coincides with that of a German speaker, but anyway, it's by Rolf Dietrich Keil. I have about 4 or 5 German translations at home, and this is my favorite of the ones that I own. Viel länger als man angenommen, blieb es noch Herbst in diesem Jahr. Der Winter wollt und wollt nicht kommen, und Schnee fiel erst im Januar, am 2. nachts. Tatjana machte den Vorhang auf, als sie erwachte, und sah ganz weiß den Hof, das Beet, das Scheunendach und das Staket, die Scheiben voller zarter Zeichen, die Bäume wintersilberklar, im Hof der Elstern muntre Schar. Und weit, so weit die Hügel reichen, des Winterteppiches Gegleis und alles, alles blendend weiß. I think it's extremely beautiful. And I just wanted to share these with you because I am a firm believer that translation can carry across almost anything. And this is an example of that. Would a reader of any of these translations have stood in the original Parthenon of Pushkin's novel in verse? I'm not going to answer that question, but I guess you know what my intuition is. Why are there so many cynical, negative, skeptical, pessimistic views of the art of translation? I do not know. Here is a positive view of translation, at last. A translation is good only when it is better than the original. This is by an Austrian, Alexander Roda, who died the year I was born. Some literary critics have exalted translation as a rebirth or even as a first birth. And I will give you a quote from a very famous book by the American literary critic George Steiner, who wrote a famous book on translation called After Babel. Here is what he says. I'll just put the bottom here. He's summarizing some remarks by Friedrich Gundolf in Shakespeare und der deutsche Geist, written in 1911. This is what essentially Gundolf said. Shakespeare was somehow hidden inside the accidental husk of English. The teleology of his full meaning, of the meaning of his meaning, the realization of his complete historico-spiritual presence lay with German, not with English. In other words, could it be that I never actually read Romeo and Juliet when I was in high school because the real deal was written not in English but in German? And could it be that the residents of Athens have never visited the Parthenon because true Parthenonity resides not in Athens but only in Nashville, Tennessee? Is that possible? Just wondering. Like the Germans, the Russians also claim that Shakespeare is better in their tongue than in the original. Indeed, that all poetry, when translated into Russian, is better than the original. However, at the same time, they insist that their greatest national hero, Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, cannot possibly be reproduced in any other language. So, that's a bit of a double standard. In other words, there exists one and only one Pushkinon, and it is in Russia, and it will forever defy rebuilding on any other soil. Well, that's quite a claim. Now I turn again to James Phelan, my great friend, and Jim has the belief, as I do, that is completely the opposite to the fake pseudo-credo professed by Nabokov, which is content and form play equal roles in the original, and so they should play equal roles in the translation. Revere the constraints of form. That's his and my philosophy. And so, Jim wrote, and it's in my book, Le Tombeau de Marot. It's in the book. He wrote it specially for my book, as it happens, an odelet to constraints, and so let me read it to you. Every task involves constraint. Solve the thing without complaint. There are magic links and chains forged to loose our rigid brains. Structures, strictures, though they bind, strangely liberate the mind. Now, this is a wonderful poem, and I could not help but decide that I had to translate it into other languages. So here's the original, and here's my Italian translation. Chi crea deve vincolarsi e farlo senza lamentarsi. Catene, per magie scure, fan fluide le menti dure. Un vincolo, se ben ci leghi, ci libera, ciò me lo spieghi. And then I had to do it into French as well. Chaque défi veut nous contraindre, mettons-nous-y sans nous en plaindre. Comme par magie, une chaîne qui nous sert de sortie de nos ornières. Curieux, mais oui, la force inouïe des formes qui libèrent l'esprit. Well, how about translating Jim Phelan's Ode into the German language? In order to realize its complete historico-spiritual presence. Das wird eure Aufgabe für morgen. In my first Albertus Magnus talk, I exposed the emptiness of MT. In my second Albertus Magnus talk, I extolled the beauty of UT. And I submit that the bottom line is there ain't no comparison. Thank you.